So now I'm going to introduce you to our fantastic chair today. So Anne, not a practical how-to session, but a wider conversation about how design education needs to change, and actually is already changing, to incorporate some of the lessons that we've been learning over the past 2 days. So we have Anne Boddington, and she has a long and distinguished career in design academia and is a Pro Vice-Chancellor for Business, Research and Innovation. She chairs the UKRI Circular Economy Programme and is the chair of the Research Excellence Framework 2021 sub-panel for Art and Design, History, Practice and Theory. Anne will bring together a brilliant group of design educators from across the world who are pioneering new ways to educate the new generation of design for planners. Anne, over to you to introduce your panel.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, if you're at least if you're in the UK, we have somebody from the UK and somebody from the US joining us today, which I'll introduce in a minute. So unfortunately, we haven't got Jonathan Chapman with us this morning, but we do have Ben Rawlence from Black Mountains College, and Anshuman Bapna from I think it's called Terra.do, and correct me if I'm wrong. We're going to have, I hope, a chance for a conversation as well as to think about what designing for planet requires. And one of the provocations that I would just like to put on the table, and I've asked the panelists to respond to, is that, as you've probably seen in the last couple of days, and I've been online for much of it, designing for planet does require thinking about design in a number of new ways. But we're facing quite a challenge because we've got declining numbers in many places in terms of design education. We've got to think about reducing materials, energy use, designing for reuse and repair, designing restorative practices in many ways, thinking about biodiversity, and all that in inclusive and systemically, and thinking systemically about what we do and how we use creativity and, I think, invention to do that. And before I pass over to our two panelists this afternoon, I'm just going to put a few provocations on the table. One of the things that fascinates me is that I was just looking up Don Norman's kind of design principles. And one of the things that Don Norman has suggested is that we're moving from human-centered design to humanity-centered design. And in that process, we're actually looking, what he's proposing as the kind of expansion of that is a look at the whole ecosystem of all living things and physical environments beyond just the human condition and human beings. But also, one of the things he challenges is to look long term. And of course, none of us have got a crystal ball. So quite how we do that and what the practices might be to do that, I think are a particular challenge. And the other one, which I think is interesting, and I don't know how we manage that, but I'm sure our panelists will tell us that, is that the professional designer is moving from, if you like, the hero model to something that is much more, or a kind of individual practice that is much more facilitative, enabling, and indeed collaborative. So those are all they're Don Norman's kind of challenges, but I think there is actually quite a challenge about whether or not it is the subject that actually drives us to change, or indeed how we educate. And one of the questions for me is, do we need a much more relational form of education? Do we need to think much more about our intersecting systems of education, not just the subjects we teach? And one of the challenges in that for all of us is we have adopted almost wholesale a modular approach to what we do, rather than perhaps a more baccalaureate approach, which is interrelational. And we seem unable to challenge that modularity. And that for me is quite a problem. And I think we're beginning to find that out. And if you take Don Norman's kind of long view, maybe it's something we need to unpack in terms of what looks remarkably like a 19th century factory in the 21st century. So I think there's some kind of questions around that. And I think the other thing I would just put on the table is, what does circularity in education actually look like? And that's a real challenge as to how we educate one another, how we work with one another in that. And why do we endlessly keep teaching students what we already know, rather than asking them or telling them what we don't know, and perhaps asking them to learn with us, rather than thinking that we have experts and we really dish out education in a rather cruder sense. So I think how we educate, which is remarkably unfashionable in research terms, and how we do that as educators when considering design, are all really big questions for me. So I'm just going to put those provocations out there amongst this panel. And we have, and I see Jonathan's just joined us, so welcome, Jonathan. It's very nice to see you. We do have now 3 very experienced, advanced and arguably very radical thinkers in that space. And I hope we can get to a point where not only do you present how you're all doing that, but actually that you might have some points either of departure, or that we all end up agreeing with each other, which quite often happens in this space. But I hope we might have a few moments to challenge that structure on a planetary scale. So I think I'm going to actually ask Anshuman to go first, if that's okay, and then that gives Ben and Jonathan a little bit of time to prepare, because you look most prepared of all, Anshuman. So I'm gonna hand over. You won't want to hear any more from me, and I've just asked them all to give us a bit of positioning and to introduce themselves. I think they can probably do their biographies far better than I can. So I'm going to pass over first to Anshuman, and if you can keep it tight and direct, that would be great, and then I'll pass on to the others later.
I will try my best, and thank you so much. So I'm Anshuman Bapna. I'm calling in from sunny California, from Palo Alto right now. And I run a company called Terra, Terra.do. The do part is the action verb of what we need to do for our Terra, for our planet. And the premise is that our mission is to get 100 million people working in climate this decade. Now, what does it take to get people to transition their skills, their mindsets, their passions into climate? Our first and most important contribution to that field is to provide a new kind of pedagogy, a new kind of learning for professionals who are looking to bring their skills to bear on different climate challenges. We've done that for 3 years now, and there have been a few realizations. I think the first big one is that both the climate crisis and the climate opportunity are deeply intertwined with each other. One lens alone is not enough. One lens can often be paralyzing or be very narrow. So we've tried to bring both of those together in our pedagogy. But it's also important to recognize that both the crisis and the opportunity look very different depending on which part of the world you live in, what kind of skills you have, and what kind of lens you use to frame this crisis and the opportunity. And finally, the pace at which both of them are moving means that this has become very much a practitioner's field, where academia has a very important role to play. But the academics who are at the forefront of this are taking what's happening on the ground, what's being implemented, and bringing that back into the lab and making those iterations faster and faster. So if you combine these observations, what I think that means is that design education has to think deeply about, one, who we learn with. So this is a global planetary problem. So who you learn with is very important. who we design for, because the positive and negative externalities of what designers do are they percolate through the system in deep, meaningful ways. And finally, how design helps everyone take the shortest path to meaningful climate action, because we don't have enough time. That's been kind of our focus, and I would love to talk a little bit more about that as we go deeper into the conversation.
Thanks very much. That was short to the point, and sweet. Now I'm going to move to Ben, I think, next, if that's okay, Ben. Is that all right?
Yes, of course.
Yes, if you're ready.
Thanks.
I'm going to
Yep.
pass over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anshuman. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I'm Ben Rawlence. I'm here in the Black Mountains in Wales, and I'm the founder and director of Black Mountains College in Wales. And our our approach is based really on our diagnosis of the problem, which is a bit more upstream, along the lines of the challenges Anne mentioned around education more broadly, and our sort of relational approach to nature, society, our environment, and each other. So Black Mountains College was founded 5 years ago as a direct response to the climate and ecological emergency, to promote new ways of thinking, new ways of working, new perspectives for climate action and adaptation. And we do that through short courses, through vocational training, and through a unique degree program, which is very much a baccalaureate approach. It's a kind of liberal arts model. It's an interdisciplinary degree program, which is called Sustainable Futures, Arts, Ecology, and Systems Change. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that, and less about the vocational programs and the short courses, because I think that that's what relates most to design education, although we're coming at it from a different perspective, which is education kind of across the board. So the idea of a degree program rather than a graduate program, which is holistic and interdisciplinary, is founded on the understanding that new kinds of literacies are required in this moment. Anne mentioned a 20th century or even a 19th century sort of industrial education system that was designed for a very different kind of economy. We are now in not only a different economy, but an entirely different environment and planet. And that means things like ecological literacies, the kind of soft skills which were always considered to be kind of collateral damage of a single subject education, like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, initiative, citizenship, those sorts of things which employers always say they want, but are actually rarely sort of formally foregrounded in education, are the substance of what we teach. So there's a few ways in which we're different. The Arts, Ecology and Systems Change degree program has earth systems elements, it has design thinking elements, it has a strong thread of political economy, as well as artistic practice. And we are trying to create change makers through that process who have a grounding in various different literacies, and who are then equipped with the skills to unleash their human capabilities and apply them to urgent challenges. So it's not a design education per se, but it is a sort of design thinking approach to a liberal arts interdisciplinary education. And we have question-based modules, which are, the first one is, how can we learn the skills we need today? The second one is, how do we understand the past? And then the third one is, how do we imagine the future? And then we have systems change, theories and frameworks 1 and 2, and then we have arts-based practice all the way through, which is designed to help students unlock their own methodology for learning, their own artistic practice, which then relates to the other elements that they study and is applied to change in practice modules. So in reference to the circularity question I mentioned, They do change in practice in year 1, 2, and 3, which is about putting into practice the systems and approaches that they're learning. So that's sort of a very brief summary of Black Mountains College and our approach. And obviously come and visit and look us up to find out more.
Thank you very much, Ben. And it's very interesting to hear about just new models emerging. I'll come back to the finances of those in a while, perhaps, but which is really challenging in terms of access. So I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan, who very nice to see after many years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, hello, everyone who's tuned into this event. Hello, Anne. Nice to see you again. And hello, Ben and Anshuman. So I'm Jonathan Chapman, and I'm talking to you today from Pittsburgh. I'm a professor and director of doctoral studies at Carnegie Mellon University School of Design. I suppose the main thing I do here is I run our PhD in transition design, me and a group of colleagues. Which I suppose you could, in the simplest terms, you could say is a 4-year research program for people looking to use design as a tool to bring about long-term systemic change in the world. I also consult quite a bit, trying to do, I suppose, that kind of work. I do a lot of circular design work out in industry and with governments, and then I write quite a bit. I've written a few books, and the particular thing I like to write about, or at least I've written about most, is designing products that last as a way to kind of reduce waste, reduce consumption, but also try to reimagine a little bit what design's role could be, because I don't think we're heading to a future with zero material production in it anytime soon. So my question is more, well, what kind of material production do we want then? So I'm, you know, I grew up academically in design schools, and I've grown up professionally in design schools. One of the first and best jobs I ever had was working for Boddington at the University of Brighton. And I remember early on in that job, actually, she said something to me, which was that she said, sorry, Anne. She said, universities are places for sustained conversations, and that they are, you know, a university, she said, is one community of learners. So, you know, whether you're on the professorial staff, whether you're working admin, whether you're a student, doesn't matter. We're all kind of gathered together in these very interesting places called universities. You know, they are low risk environments. They're like greenhouses. You can grow anything in a university. That's what they're for. And so we gather together, and we spend months, years, and sometimes entire careers trying to figure out like how we can do this better. And I'm sure in the 1950s, the questions that kept us awake at night would, in terms of how we can do it better, would be a little different than they are today in 2023. But the design school has always been a self-aware place that reflects every day on how we can do this better. You know, the futures we want to design our way towards, and the futures we want to design our way away from, right? So I think in design, that's what fuels us, really. I think is this ongoing debate, ferocious debate at times, on what that is. And then I suppose behind the scenes, as educators, we ask a lot of questions around, okay, so how do you do that then? What are the learning experiences that help with that? And I look forward to this discussion, you know, getting into that a bit. But I want to put a couple of things out there. So one thing that I'm really kind of interested in at the moment is, I suppose, you know, we talk about systems change quite a lot, and so we should. And that sometimes drops a massive scale upon things, as it should. But I also notice that certainly with the organizations that I work with, that in the end, you have a room full of people who aren't Google or Microsoft or Nike or H&M. They're not those things. They're just people going to work trying to figure out how to to do meaningful things and do good things and hopefully create as little chaos in the process. And I feel like the individual person scale, the power of one, is a really interesting place to start in education. So we can talk about these macro ideas, massive systemic complex ideas. But I think if we do that without talking about the individual and what their personal stake in it is, their unique positionality, the place from which they see the world, you know, their worldview, which is different to mine, which is different to yours. That is the bit that matters, I think, in design. So the idea I want to leave you with, and then I'll pass on to the next person, is two things. So one is the agenda and one is the craft. And something that I always really prioritize in my teaching here at Carnegie Mellon is that each student's, you know, I think design, you know, it's about having an agenda. Like, why are you doing this anyway? Like, what's all this work for? I don't care how many awards it's won. I don't care how many people you quoted along the way. What's it for, really? What's its agenda? What's your agenda? What kind of future are you advocating for by proposing these things? And then I think the second thing, which is different, is the craft. It's like, okay, so as a maker or as a writer or as someone who writes songs, you know, or someone who spends 6 days a week working in slip cast ceramics, like whatever, you know, what's your craft? Like, how do you express this and how do you manifest that agenda in the world? How does this belief of yours, which you've had for as long as you can remember, how does this belief of yours turn into things? How does it touch the world and make the kind of change that you know needs to be made? And so for me, design happens well when the agenda and the craft kind of synthesize into one practice where it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. So for me, good education is education that manages to do that. And with that, I'll pass back to Anne.
Well, that's left us with a challenge for sure. And I think there are some real common themes in what you're all saying. I guess, though, one of the things that still comes to mind for me is what the blockers are in this conversation, because and I'm going to be kind of very crude about this on one level. You know, whether it's at Black Mountains College or whether it's that you take a course at Terra, or whether you apply to be at Carnegie Mellon, unless you get a scholarship, access to that is really hard. And it's kind of how do you do that? I mean, Anshuman raised it, you know, depending on where you are in the world, your access to education or to that dialogue is difficult. And I'd really like to hear from you all, given that I think you've got some real common missions in place, how you kind of see that blocker of access. And one of the reasons I'm interested in circularity in education is how we educate one another, how your students become your educators. So you multiply that structure in a more sophisticated way, other than it's only about those who can pay, because that's a real challenge for me. And I really like to hear how you think we might do that, and what those blockers, or how do we manage those kind of blockers. And I don't know if anybody wants to stick their hand up, or whether I'm going to point fingers at people. Anshuman, I'm going to point a finger, because otherwise we'll all be sitting here looking at each other.
No, I'm happy to go first. We started this company right around the time when COVID started. So the world was already beginning to look different. On top of that, my own personal belief has been that the scale of mobilization that we're talking about is such that we would have to figure out, sometimes even crude, but nonetheless effective, highly scalable ways of getting lots and lots of people access to what it means to be working in climate. And therefore, from day one, our entire pedagogy had been designed around trying to get people wherever they are, in whichever part of the world that they are in, often working a job already, and therefore did not have time for full-time education necessarily, being able to come in and access all this learning. Now, access itself is can be broken down into a couple of different buckets, right? One of them is just money. There are ways to solve that. In our case, for example, we do scholarships. We do scholarships with sometimes a very deep intent in mind. So, for example, if you're a journalist, especially if you're a journalist in the global south, the program is free for you. And we extend that in a couple of different ways. But it's not just about money. It's also about time. And it's also about what invitation you extend and what words you use to extend that invitation for someone to come and join you to learn. The example of that is what we do in our open houses right before our programs start. So our open houses are truly open in the sense that we get a few alums to talk about their transition journeys. And these alums typically come from backgrounds that some of them are pretty traditional expectations, but some of them are unusual. So an alum could come from a big tech Google background and now goes to work designing something for a hardware climate company, which is great. But we would also get someone who is working at an oil and gas company and trying to figure out how to get the company to be a lot more serious about their decarbonization agenda, which they often pay lip service to. And that is as much a design challenge as an organizational design challenge that they encounter and try to succeed at. So the words that we use to invite those people in is another example. And the last, I think, thing that I will just add here is from a pedagogy standpoint, and this was a humbling experience for us, which was, it often felt, I mean, we've known this from the classroom experiences that we have had all through our lives, that the best ones are one where you learn not just from the expert or the teacher, but you learn from each other. And pulling that off in an online environment is not entirely straightforward. And I think the key idea there that has worked really well for us is this idea of a community of practice, which is that these skills are, think of these programs that we run as at most great onboarding sessions, multiple weeks, sometimes multiple months, that you get to deeply immerse yourself in something along with a community or a cohort of others who you start building relationships with. And then once the program is over, your onboarding is done, but your journey of being a truly mindful practitioner has just begun. So what happens in our cohorts, for example, is that we have something that looks like a class ambassador or a cohort ambassador or ambassadors who take ownership and then use our network of tens of thousands of climate professionals and people who have made this transition already to keep bringing in speakers, keep hosting events, keep pushing out policy papers, etc., into this community of practice, so that every morning when you wake up, you're getting just a tad bit better or more intentful about the practice that you have. So that's been our pedagogy that has worked for us.
Interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that Jonathan quoted me earlier, but one of the things I think that's true about that is learning how to learn, but also learning how to then communicate to others and listen to others. Actually, is part of that community of practice. If that's the right way to describe it. And I think the other issue, which I think all of you do in probably different ways, is learning in public. It's learning in the public realm. Rather than actually in a very discrete place. Ben, how about Black Mountains College?
No, I think
in terms of access.
Sure. Yeah, I think your question is good and appropriate, and I think it gets at several different problems. So the first is tuition fees, which in Wales, I'm happy to say there's no tuition fees in further education. So we do vocational training in future skills, and we have core skills sessions which go along with that, and all of that's free. So we have a sort of policy problem in the UK in particular, which is less acute in Europe and obviously more acute in America. But I think the way that if you're serious about access and you're serious about a social role for your institution, then you are playing, you're both playing a kind of public advocacy role on those issues to do with tuition fees and public education. So there's the sort of nuts and bolts, and then there's the wider social mission of public education, and that calls into question, the trendy phrase, the civic mission of universities, which many of which are grappling with. And I think if you're a values-based institution, so we, for example, we're not an agricultural college, we're not a further education college, we're not a university. We're a college dedicated to climate action and adaptation. So everything we do is around that mission. And that means that we have a range of public education offerings, some of which are pay what you can, some of which are free, some of which are paid for by Powys County Council. And we also have public talks and events, again, which are free, which are for the students, but also for the community. And that there's a new program rolling out this winter, which will be recorded online and made available free. So that goes hand in hand with our own reflective practice and community practice, which we're starting to make public as well. So instead of having kind of actions written up from our tutor meeting, we're actually going to have a reflective blog where we share issues we're grappling with and how we think pedagogy needs to innovate under the current circumstances. So I think there's a job to do in terms of reimagining systems and processes based on values, and that goes right. That is actually quite a disruptive idea. So what Jonathan said earlier about agenda and craft is actually quite, I would say, an almost old-fashioned traditional sense of education, which is quite hard to come by these days, because often students are not asked what their agenda is. And their craft is determined by the industry and the skills gaps which curriculum planners have designed that they're trying to plug. So unleashing, the both the sort of emotional, spiritual, and human capabilities of students, and then allying that with with a craft with an agenda that's appropriate to their craft is a profoundly moral, ethical, possibly political mission, which is actually at variance with a lot of the kind of corporate structures and business arrangements of many universities. So I think there's a big issue around not just access but purpose, access and purpose together, which centers on a conversation around values.
Thank you very much for that, and that's really helpful. Just to come back then, we've talked a lot, and you've both talked about communities of practice, Wenger's communities of practice, and I think one of the things that you've also talked about, and interestingly, is about the craft of learning, and actually the generosity it requires to learn with others is quite significant. Jonathan, did you want to come back on that, given you're in a elite institution? Yeah. Very nice one, but an elite one all the same.
No, for sure. Yeah, it's there are some interesting contradictions being in an elite private university whilst supporting students doing anti-capitalist work. It's the sort of I think many of us who work in systems change find ourselves leading double lives. Not all of us, but I think many of us often note the contradiction. I think the financial barrier is one of many barriers, and it's definitely a real one. Yeah. I could speak to our PhD program, where a team of us, when we just redesigned it in 2017, we came up with a financial model for the program where half the researchers who take our program have industry funding or grant funding, and that comes in, and then that goes straight out again for the other half of our students who come tuition free as teaching fellows, and they do a little teaching service. And so actually our PhD program doesn't make money. I'd say it almost actually loses a little, perhaps. But as a department that also has undergraduate courses and graduate courses and a PhD program, we believe that that's just a necessary move to make in order to create space to do political edgy work like that. But it is a real barrier. I think another barrier that we're trying to overcome is the barrier of language. And by that, I don't just mean English as a second language, although that's part of it. I mean more the way universities and the people who work in them have this habit of packaging their ideas in this horribly complicated, impossible to understand kind of language, which is like completely ridiculous. And it's a very old, marginalizing idea, which kind of suggests that, you know, if you're not smart enough to understand this, then I guess you're just not one of the crowd. I guess you're just outside. And over here, we'll just have the grown-up conversation while you fumble around over there. And it's really patronizing and out of date. And one of the things we're doing on our PhD program, which is a highly competitive, brilliant program. The people on it are just, you know, just absolutely phenomenally wonderful, very brilliant people, but also very kind and thoughtful people. And one of the practices we're trying to cultivate on this is that when you write and when you speak, you do so like you would normally, like just be you and say what you want to say. Because we believe that if you actually want the work to have reach and you want people to be able to access it, you know, the question you asked Anne was something about access, and I know it was about money, but I think we build barriers like this all the time to access. And I think if we can't, you can barely get a journal paper published these days without using the word ontology in the first paragraph. It's ridiculous. It's all gone way too far, way too far. So, yeah. And then maybe one other quick barrier, which I think is kind of problematic, relates to the kinds of qualifications and profile you need to build in order to get into a university, not just like the one I work in, but like many universities. And I think that world exists, and obviously I support it because I work in one, but I think it represents a type of learning, and it's wonderful to see colleagues and Ben from Black, you know, it's really wonderful to see that there are so many different ways you can present learning opportunities to the world, which don't always require a particular kind of on-ramp, you know, an 18-year-long on-ramp that gets you into that place, because not everyone is fortunate enough to be in a position to do that.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to turn to the positives now, because I think we ought to always end on a positive, and it is the end. It is beginning to be the end of the conference, and two of this session. And so I'm going to wrap two kind of questions together, really, in terms of the audience, which is really important. And we've got about 7 minutes, so if you can give me a kind of sharp answer rather than a long one, is about enablers. And if you had to give, whether it was government or wherever you are in the world, or your institution, or indeed your business, a kind of a piece of advice, what would be the enablers, and what would be the kind of first next action? If you said to people, what are you going to do tomorrow to make a difference in this kind of space so that actually we can make a shift? What would it be from each of you? What would be that kind of key change that you would make? So I'm going to go around the table again. So sorry, Anshuman, you're going to come first.
So I think one, just to this audience, which is that I've been in the tech and social sector for about 20 years now. Often they've been completely disjointed from each other. If I could just open up your eyes and to everyone's eyes on how what's happening right now is so remarkable. The fact that profit and purpose are combining in a way, the capital P on both, that I haven't seen before. That if you were thinking about your careers right now, this is the most amazing place that you could be in, and the world needs you. So I think that's one simple message that I would love for everyone to kind of take away. And I think on the other side,
Great takeaway.
Yeah. And I think on the other side, for the powers that be, to me, the flip side of that, which is this is an opportunity not just to fix the carbon in our atmosphere or increase biodiversity or reduce our use of natural resources. It's also, there's a very human framing to it as well, which I think is very important for the powers to be to also recognize and propagate, which is that this is also an opportunity for us, just because the climate crisis is so intertwined with all our social ills and how we relate to each other and to the natural world around us, that this is also an opportunity to fix a lot of the social ills in society in the garb of fixing our climate crisis. So that level of ambition, in a way, is kind of increasing the ambition of an already very ambitious problem. But that is, I think, something I would love for them to think about.
Okay, so it's our human relations. Our human relations are critical in that, in order to fix the climate. Okay, Ben.
Thanks, Anne. I would say, I think from where I'm teaching and sitting at the moment, education actually is one of the most fertile grounds and opportunities for transformative change. Where we've got serious blockages in economics and politics. Yes, some nice indications, as Anshuman has mentioned, but I think, you know, we're still seeing expansion of fossil fuels when we shouldn't, and so on. And education is actually the place for a huge territory of hope, optimism, and transformative potential. And as a kind of political field of, if you like, as a place to invite people to get involved, education is where it's at. Because even if, you know, whatever your standpoint on sort of doom or techno fantasies or and so on, we've got a job to do to prepare the next generation, and everybody's got something to contribute. So, you know, the more energy and enthusiasm and creativity that goes into the education space, the better. And you know, there are very few problems out there that don't get solved from the supply side perspective. So pumping out more engaged, excited, motivated, grounded young people is I think a very exciting and compelling mission.
Thank you, and that we couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's one of the key things that we do in the world, and the most optimistic things we do in the world, for sure. Jonathan.
Well, so I think, yeah, so I think designers are optimists at heart. I don't think you get very far in design unless you believe things are possible. So I think these people need to be reminded of that. And there's a lot of doom and gloom, as my colleagues in this discussion have said, and we mustn't focus too much on that. I think on the one hand, I think we're nowhere near pissed off enough, you know, in design schools. I think we should be much more outraged and furious about the current circumstances than we actually are. But then I think to be able to convert that into some form of action is the key, isn't it? It's like the outrage alone is not necessarily going to do much good. So I think the conversion into action requires us to make peace with the fact that as an individual, the work you do will be nowhere near enough, given the enormity and scale of the crisis. But that's how it is. That's what it is. And what we need are millions of people doing small things that on their own are nowhere near enough. But when you gather it together, you know, that murmuration idea, it's like when you gather it together, then it's enough. So I think we all need to get comfortable with that and doing what you can. Maybe what no one else can, but what you can.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that's great. Just in summary, I've got 3 takeaways. One is the power of communities of practice. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you've talked about. 2, I think something around the craft of learning and respecting the craft of learning. And the 3rd, which I think Ben kind of pushed on, and certainly all of you have pushed on in different ways, is giving the confidence to a next generation and a generation after that to be able to act. And I think we lost a lot of confidence in COVID, particularly. And I think it really showed. And I think that sense of confidence and optimism is probably a great place to leave and to hand back to Alicia. Can I just thank you all? Little bit of a crisis is starting, but actually thank you for your contributions. It's great to meet you, and I'm handing back to I think to Alicia. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much to our amazing panelists. That was an incredible discussion and very kind of inspiring about the future of education and integrating sustainability into the core of each conversation within the education space. So thank you all. So we're coming to the end of this session. So I'm just going to very quickly share some of the data from the poll from the start. So just to say, so the main barrier for Design for Planet, the two that were identified as the main barrier, one was policy and regulation, and another one was skills, knowledge and education. So that links in closely and also into the theme of collaboration, and hopefully like Design for Planet itself has been an incredible resource, certainly for myself, to learn about so many other topics and thinking about how they intersect as well, because there's so many different niches of design where we can transition knowledge across as well. So and just to now kind of wrap up the couple of days. So essentially, so day one, we embarked on a journey to find the perfect carbon calculation tool, looking at how they varied across different sectors of the creative industries. And then we also spoke about the wider impact of UX design. And the brothers revealed 3 incredibly valuable tools, and don't worry, we'll be sharing resources after so you have access to them as well, especially the first 2. And then we also delved into the fascinating world of agile circular manufacturing and the potential of this for sustainability. And then today we had some incredible sessions in the how-to stream as well, where we looked at, we had an amazing session with Natasha Chapman looking at anti-oppressive co-creation. In this session, we created a social map live to identify the blind spots within, and that really helped set the tone for the session. And she filled it with so many amazing resources in there as well. And then followed by that, we've had so many great sessions today, but we also looked at biology and how to look into nature in order to design solutions. And there were some case studies shared, one, for example, of a headphone which looked at the structure of a shell to enhance the acoustic properties of it as well. So we've had an amazing day on the how-to, and I know that Alicia has also been hosting some incredible sessions, and we've been messaging about them all day. And so I'll hand you over to her to summarise her experience over the past 2 days.
Hi, everyone. So just to round up, so on day 2, as an addition to Alicia, we've gained so much knowledge, including the power of how bites can empower a theatre to become more sustainable, risk of class appropriation and cultural appropriation with mending techniques, and the value of material choices like natural fibers, how digital twins could be the future of concrete carbon measuring, and the importance of rebalancing landscapes to ensure that they actually thrive. I'll give this over back to Alicia to close this out. Thanks
so much, Alicia. So that's really it for our digital how-to sessions for Design for Planet. So in the theme of collaboration, I really encourage you to reach out to individuals who you've enjoyed the talk of and continue the discussion. Look at the resources that we circulate to delve deeper into these topics as well. And I've personally found myself that within the industry of sustainable design, and we're all working towards the same common goal. So people are so open to help each other. So it's an incredible community. So you can now switch back to the main stage stream for our final keynote with Sandrine Street from Visa, sharing a very collaborative story on a new model of sustainable consumption. And that's it from us. So see you again next year. Thanks again.